I thought it was just another day at the lighthouse until I realized I wasn't alone. That IT was a normal afternoon, and I was 22, working my summer job as an assistant at a small lighthouse off the coast of Maine. I'd been here for a few weeks, mostly cleaning, checking the light, and keeping logs of the weather. The island was quiet most of the time: seagulls, waves crashing against the rocks, and the occasional fisherman passing by in the distance. Life felt routine, even comforting in its solitude. That day, the fog had rolled in earlier than usual. By the time I climbed the narrow metal stairs to check the light, visibility was down to maybe 20 feet. I remember thinking how beautiful it looked, the fog muffling everything, turning the ocean into a soft gray canvas. But there was something odd about it, too. The foghorn, which should have sounded every 15 minutes, hadn't blown in over an hour. That wasn't normal. I shrugged it off, assuming the mechanism might have jammed, and planned to check it after finishing my rounds. I was alone as usual. The lighthouse keeper had left that morning, promising he'd return by sunset. I liked working alone most days. It gave me time to think, and the isolation felt peaceful. I had my radio and a small flashlight, and I walked the familiar metal walkways along the edge of the lighthouse platform, checking the equipment and making sure nothing had shifted during the high tide. Everything seemed ordinary. Everything seemed safe. But then I heard it. At first, I thought it was the wind, or maybe a gull landing somewhere on the rocks below, but it wasn't right. There was a faint scrape, like someone dragging a shoe across the metal stairs behind me. My pulse jumped. I spun around, flashlight swinging, but the stairs were empty. Must be a branch, I whispered to myself. The lighthouse's shadows were long in the fog, twisting and moving with every wave of light from the fogged-over windows. Yet something about the movement didn't feel natural. I tried to shake it off. I had spent hours alone here before. I knew the sound of the ocean and the metal structures. But as I reached the top landing to inspect the light, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. One of the windows, normally locked and sealed, was slightly open. Just a crack. Not enough for a person to slip through easily, but enough to notice if you weren't expecting it. I froze. I'd locked that window myself that morning. At that moment, I realized I wasn't entirely alone. The lighthouse, which had always felt safe in its isolation, suddenly felt exposed. The fog pressed in on me from all sides, and the faint scrape came again, slower this time, closer. The sense of routine, the calm of a normal day, was gone. Something was on the island with me. Something that didn't belong. I wanted to tell myself it was nothing, that I was overreacting. But deep down, I knew it wasn't the wind. It wasn't a gull. And whatever it was moving toward me. The lighthouse where I worked was perched on a small rocky island just off the coast of Maine. It wasn't very large, just the main tower, a small keeper's house, and a narrow walkway along the cliff edge. From a distance, it looked picturesque, the white paint contrasting against the dark rocks and endless gray ocean. Up close, though, it was colder and harsher than it appeared. The metal railings were always slick with salt, and the wind cut through every layer of clothing I wore. I arrived early that morning like I always did. The sky was overcast, and the tide was still coming in, covering the lower rocks. I had a few tasks to finish before the keeper returned in the evening. The main light had been serviced, and the logs were up to date, but the foghorns. Timing seemed off. The keeper mentioned it might be acting up again, and he asked me to keep an eye on it. Aside from that, the day promised to be uneventful. I spent the morning checking equipment in the tower. The spiral staircase creaked under my boots, and the walls were cold and damp. Outside, the wind pushed waves hard against the rocks. The smell of salt and seaweed was strong, mixing with the faint oil and metal smell from the generator room. Even though the island was isolated, it had a rhythm. The ocean made a steady, predictable noise, and the seagulls' calls marked the hours. The isolation wasn't lonely, it was peaceful. That's why I liked this job. I wasn't completely alone, though. There was the lighthouse keeper, Mr. Hayes, a quiet man in his late 50s who had worked here for decades. He left in the morning to visit the mainland, trusting me to keep things running. And there were occasional tourists who visited the Lighthouse Museum, though rarely during midweek. That day, I had no visitors, which meant it was just me and the wind, the waves, and the fog rolling in from the ocean. By mid-afternoon, the fog thickened, and the lighthouse felt even smaller. The light inside the tower glowed weakly against the gray, making long shadows along the walls. The radio crackled softly in the background, mostly static, with the occasional signal from a fishing boat or passing ferry. Everything seemed normal, but the quiet made even small sounds stand out. A distant gull, the creak of the metal stairwell, or the slap of waves against the rocks. I spent some time on the outdoor walkway, inspecting the railing and checking the foghorn. From there, I could see the jagged rocks below, the waves crashing hard enough to spray up to the walkway. The fog blurred the horizon, making it impossible to see the mainland. The lighthouse felt completely cut off from the world, but in a way that was reassuring at first. It was routine, calm. It was just another day in a job I had done for weeks. But in the back of my mind, something felt slightly off. A part of me noticed how quiet it was, how the usual rhythm of the lighthouse seemed paused, like the entire island was holding its breath. I couldn't explain it, and I tried not to think about it. Everything looked normal. Everything seemed safe. And that was exactly what made what happened next so unexpected. By late afternoon, the fog had grown thick, wrapping the lighthouse in a gray, silent shroud. The wind had slowed slightly, leaving the waves to crash against the rocks in uneven bursts. I was checking the metal staircases for rust and loose bolts, clipboard in hand, when I first noticed something odd. A faint scrape echoed from the upper levels of the tower. At first, I assumed it was just the metal expanding in the damp air. I paused, listening closely, but the sound didn't repeat immediately. Still, a small chill ran down my spine. The lighthouse was supposed to be empty except for me. There was no one else on the island. I went back to my work, brushing it off. But then came the second sign, a shadow. It moved across the keeper's house window, quick, subtle, almost like a trick of the fog and the fading light. I stopped and stared. The window was supposed to be locked, sealed tight. Nothing should have been there. I squinted, but the shadow was gone before I could make sense of it. A few minutes later, I heard it again, a soft, deliberate creak from the spiral staircase behind me. I froze. My flashlight illuminated the steps, and for a moment, I thought I saw someone at the top, crouched, just watching. I blinked, and the shape was gone. My heart rate picked up slightly, though I tried to stay calm. The lighthouse had been my workplace for weeks, and I knew how easily shadows and fog could play tricks on the eyes. Still, something didn't feel right. The foghorn remained silent, even though it should have sounded hours ago. And there was a smell, metallic, faint, almost like rusted tools or wet clothing, drifting from the stairwell. It was subtle, but out of place. I turned the corner slowly, expecting to see nothing, but my instinct screamed that something was watching me. I moved toward the light tower, trying to focus on my checklist. But every few steps, I heard soft thuds, like someone pacing or shifting weight, coming from areas I knew were empty. The sounds didn't have the randomness of the wind or the sea. They were intentional, controlled. Then came the heaviest hint, the feeling of being observed. I couldn't see anyone, but I felt eyes on me, tracking me as I climbed the narrow stairwell. My hands gripped the railing tighter. Every instinct in my body told me to leave, to run back to the keeper's house, but I kept telling myself it was impossible. No one could be here. Even as I reached the top landing, the tension didn't ease. The lighthouse, which had always felt safe in its isolation, now seemed different. The quiet wasn't comforting anymore, it was waiting. Every small sound echoed like it had purpose. Every shadow seemed deliberate. I could feel the air grow heavier, as if the fog itself had a presence I couldn't see. I checked the foghorn again, tapping at the controls. Nothing. And then, in that moment of stillness, I realized how alone I actually was. Completely alone, except for the sense that someone or something was moving silently just beyond the edges of my vision. That was the first real moment I understood. This wasn't just a quiet day at the lighthouse. Something had come to the island with me. By the time the sun began to sink behind the fog, the lighthouse no longer felt like a place of work. It felt like a trap. The earlier signs of unease had escalated. Every creak of the metal stairs, every gust of wind against the windows, now made me flinch. I tried to tell myself I was imagining things, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. I was on the spiral staircase, clipboard in hand, when I heard it again, deliberate footsteps above me. Slow, measured, and unmistakably human. My stomach dropped. There shouldn't have been anyone on the lighthouse. Mr. Hayes had left hours ago, and visitors wouldn't be around until next week. Whoever or whatever was up there, they weren't supposed to be. The foghorn still hadn't sounded. That should have been a warning, but now it felt like the silence was a signal. I moved cautiously, trying to follow the faint sound, and that's when I noticed something on the landing above, the faint outline of a figure against the dim light of the keeper's room. I froze. It wasn't fully visible, just a shadow, a human shape that didn't belong. My first instinct was to call out, but my voice caught in my throat. I stepped back, and the figure shifted. A scrape against the metal railing followed. Whoever it was, they were moving closer. I could hear breathing now, low and slow, echoing off the tower walls. My mind raced. I considered running down the stairs to the main floor, but even that felt risky. The lighthouse was narrow. I would be trapped if they were waiting at the bottom. I tried the radio, hoping to get a signal, but static answered me. The isolation I had once found comforting now felt dangerous. The fog outside seemed thicker, enclosing me, cutting off escape routes. Every instinct in my body screamed to leave, yet every path forward seemed impossible. Then came a noise that made my blood run cold, a soft tap, repeated, like someone testing each step of the staircase before descending. It was methodical. Someone was stalking me, moving deliberately through the lighthouse, making sure I noticed them but not showing themselves fully. My hands shook as I gripped the railing. I couldn't see the face, couldn't see a weapon, but the presence felt threatening, real and unavoidable. I moved toward the keeper's room, thinking maybe I could barricade myself inside. But the closer I got, the clearer it became. The intruder wasn't stationary. The footsteps echoed from different directions now, above and around me. Every turn I took seemed to bring me face to face with shadows. Every sound told me they were close, closer than I expected. I leaned against the railing, trying to steady my breathing, telling myself I had to think. Whoever it was had been here for a while. They knew the lighthouse, the stairs, the layout. That thought alone made my stomach twist. I wasn't just being watched, they were hunting, positioning, waiting for me to make a move. For the first time since starting this job, I felt completely trapped. The lighthouse, which had once been a safe, predictable place, was now an enclosed maze. And somewhere above me, in the gray fog and shadows, the intruder was moving closer. Every step brought them nearer, and every step made it harder to ignore the reality. I wasn't alone. And whatever this person wanted, it wasn't going to end quietly. By the time I reached the top landing, I knew I wasn't just imagining things. The shadow I had seen earlier had grown more distinct. A man stood there, or maybe crouched, but fully aware of me. I could see the outline of his jacket, the way his head tilted slightly, watching my every move.
He didn't speak.
He didn't move at first, but the air between us felt heavy, charged. My heart pounded in my chest. I backed up slowly, trying not to make sudden noises. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but the staircase behind me looked like a trap. If I ran, he could block the landing above. If I stayed, I had no idea what he might do next. Then he moved. Not quickly, but deliberate. One step forward. My stomach dropped, and I bolted. I ran down the spiral staircase 2 steps at a time, banging against the metal railing, my flashlight swinging wildly. The echo of my own footsteps was swallowed by his, close behind me now, deliberate, unrelenting. I reached the main floor and tried the door to the keeper's house.
Locked.
I pounded on it, yelling, hoping Mr. Hayes or someone on the mainland could hear me. My hands were shaking, my breaths coming in short, ragged gasps. Then I heard it, a heavy thump from above. He had followed me. He was in the lighthouse, moving with purpose. I scanned the room. There was a storage closet near the generator, barely wide enough to hide. I dove inside, pulling the door shut and pushing a crate in front of it. I could hear his breathing now, closer, circling. Every scrape of his shoes on the metal floor made my stomach tighten. I crouched, clutching my flashlight like a weapon, trying to stay silent. Minutes felt like hours. I listened as he moved around the room, shifting boxes, tapping on the walls. I didn't dare breathe. I didn't dare move. The silence between his movements was worse than the sound itself, like he was enjoying the hunt, waiting for me to make a mistake. Finally, I heard a click. The main door opened. He didn't come in immediately, but I could hear him pausing, looking, sensing that I was somewhere in the room. My hands gripped the crate tighter, trying not to make a sound. My heart felt like it would burst. And then, the faintest sound of sirens in the distance.
Police.
He froze. I don't know if it was instinct or fear of getting caught, but he slipped back toward the stairs and vanished before the officers arrived. I stumbled out, shaken, covered in sweat and salt from the ocean spray. The police searched the lighthouse and found a small hidden crawl space in the upper loft. That's where he had been living. Tools, food, and even a small knife were found. They said he could have been there for days, watching me without my knowing. I left the lighthouse that night, but the image of him, crouched and silent in the shadows, never left me. Every time I think of that foggy island, I can still feel his eyes on me, even though I know he's gone. After the police arrived, I thought the worst was over. I was still shaking, sitting on the cold metal walkway outside the lighthouse, watching the fog roll in like a gray curtain over the ocean. The officers moved methodically through the lighthouse, checking every room, every closet, every staircase. I followed them hesitantly, my flashlight barely piercing the gloom. Then one of them found the crawl space above the keeper's room. It wasn't obvious, a small trapdoor hidden under a pile of old supplies. He called out, and the officer lifted it slowly. Inside was the man, not just hiding casually but fully prepared. He had a sleeping bag, canned food, a small knife, and climbing gear. He had been living there unseen for days, maybe weeks. My stomach dropped. The most shocking part, though, came when they searched his belongings. He had detailed notes, maps of the lighthouse, schedules of my shifts, and observations about my routines. Every movement I made, he had tracked it. Every sound I heard, every shadow I thought was a trick of the light, had been him, silently following me through the tower. I couldn't breathe. I kept picturing him crouched in that crawl space, watching me climb the stairs, move along the walkways, check the foghorn, completely invisible to me. The realization hit harder than any fear I had felt while he was in the lighthouse. The danger hadn't been a random encounter. It had been calculated, methodical, and he had known exactly when to make himself known to maximize terror. The officer explained that this wasn't just trespassing. He had been ready for far worse. Knife, the climbing equipment, the notes, it all suggested he could have waited for the perfect moment to attack. I realized that I had been incredibly lucky. If I had been a few minutes slower, or if I hadn't noticed the shadow at the window, the outcome could have been very different. Another officer mentioned something I didn't want to hear. This man had no prior identification. No record, no home address, no known relatives. He had vanished into the system. It was as if he existed only in the shadows. That detail stayed with me the most. The idea that someone could live among the walls, unseen, and then disappear without a trace. I kept picturing him moving silently through the lighthouse, studying my habits, knowing when I would be alone, when I would be most vulnerable. The entire day, every uneasy feeling, every small noise that had made me pause, now made sense. It wasn't random. It was him. Every detail I had ignored, every instinct I brushed off, it had been warning me, and I hadn't understood until it was almost too late. The twist left me shaken. The threat hadn't just been present, it had been intimately aware of me, tracking my every move, and could have struck at any moment. What I had thought was a routine day on a quiet lighthouse was actually the edge of something much more deliberate and dangerous. The knowledge that someone could prepare so thoroughly, hide so completely, and plan so silently made the island feel permanently unsafe. Even now, when I think back, it's not the shadow or the footsteps that haunt me. It's the fact that someone had been there, unseen, knowing me better than I knew myself. That was the truth that changed everything. Even after the police took him away, the lighthouse never felt the same. I returned a few days later to retrieve some of my belongings and check on the equipment. The fog had rolled in again, thick and gray, hugging the island like it always did. But this time, it felt different, heavier, almost watching. Every step I took along the metal walkways made me glance over my shoulder, expecting to see him crouched in the shadows, waiting. The crawl space above the keeper's room was boarded up now, sealed with locks and police tape. But I knew, deep down, that it wasn't the structure I feared, it was the man himself. Whoever he was, he had disappeared once before. No ID, no records, nothing. And there was no guarantee he wouldn't come back. That thought refused to leave my mind. I kept checking the windows, the staircases, the foghorn, even though logically I knew he was gone. Every creak of metal made me flinch. Every shadow stretching across the walls in the fog seemed deliberate, as if someone was moving just out of sight. I tried to tell myself it was paranoia, that the police had handled it, that the island was empty and safe. But the rational part of me was weaker than the memory of being watched, hunted, trapped. That night, back in my small apartment on the mainland, I couldn't sleep. I kept imagining him crouched in the crawlspace, noting every detail of the lighthouse, every pattern of my movements, waiting for another chance. Even though he had been taken, the thought that he might have had accomplices, or might simply return, lingered. The image of the shadow, the slow, deliberate footsteps, the cold, silent gaze, it stayed with me. Friends asked why I looked so tense when I told them the story. I said it was just nerves. But I didn't mention the part that bothered me most. The tiny signs I had noticed that day, footsteps, shadows, the windows slightly ajar, could have been happening for days before I even arrived. How long had he been watching? How many times had he moved through that lighthouse while I thought I was alone? The answers remain unknown. Sometimes, when I drive along the coast near lighthouses, I catch a glimpse of a shadow on the rocks or a figure at a distance. My stomach tightens. My mind goes back to that foggy island, to the cold metal staircases, to the sound of someone pacing above me. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that he or someone like him might still be there, somewhere, waiting. The police never solved the mystery completely. They closed the case after a week, saying there was no evidence he had returned. But I can't forget. I can't stop thinking that lighthouses, isolated and silent, might hide watchers in the shadows. And sometimes, late at night, I hear a creak or a whisper in my mind and wonder, was he really gone, or is he still waiting for someone else to arrive alone? The lighthouse stands on the rocks, white and silent in the fog. To anyone else, it's a picturesque landmark, safe and ordinary. But for me, it's a reminder that danger can hide in the quietest places, and that even when you think it's over, someone could still be watching, patient, and waiting for the perfect moment to appear again.